David always thought he was stronger than most people. At 34 years old, he had built his entire life around the idea that real men handle their problems alone. When things got tough, you didn't run to others for help. You figured it out yourself. That's what his father taught him, and that's what he believed. But sitting in his quiet apartment on another Friday night, David felt anything but strong. The silence around him seemed to press against his chest like a heavy blanket. He could hear his neighbor's television through the thin walls, the sound of laughter from some comedy show. It made his own loneliness feel even sharper. 6 months had passed since his wife packed her bags and left. The divorce papers sat in a folder on his kitchen counter, signed and final. She had tried to explain why she was leaving, but her words felt like noise to him. Something about feeling disconnected, about him being emotionally unavailable. He didn't understand it then, and he still didn't understand it now. His daughter lived with her mother across town. At 16, she was busy with her own life, friends, and school activities. When he called, their conversations felt forced and awkward. She would answer his questions with short responses, and he could hear the distance in her voice. It wasn't anger exactly, but something worse. It was indifference. Work had become just another source of frustration. For the third time in 2 years, the promotion he had been hoping for went to someone else. His boss delivered the news with the usual corporate language about other candidates having different strengths and keeping up the good work. David nodded and smiled, but inside he felt like screaming. The evenings were the worst. During the day he could stay busy with work tasks and errands, but when the sun went down and he returned to his empty apartment, the weight of everything crashed down on him. He would heat up a frozen dinner, eat it while watching the news, then sit on his couch scrolling through his phone until he fell asleep. His friends had stopped calling as much. At first, they invited him out for drinks or to watch games. But David always had excuses. He was tired or busy or just not in the mood. Eventually, the invitations became less frequent. He told himself he preferred it this way. Dealing with other people's questions and fake sympathy was exhausting. The apartment felt like a prison sometimes. It was a nice enough place with big windows and modern appliances, but it had never felt like home. His ex-wife had taken most of the furniture and decorations when she left. Now the rooms felt hollow, with bare walls and empty spaces where life used to be. Sleep became his enemy. He would lie in bed for hours, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. Regrets about things he said or didn't say. Worry about his daughter growing up without him around. Fear about his future and whether things would ever get better. When he finally did sleep, he often woke up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding from dreams. He couldn't remember Dot at the grocery store. He watched families shopping together, parents and children laughing over which cereal to buy. The sight made his chest tight with something he couldn't name. He had once been part of something like that. Now he wandered the aisles alone, buying food for one person. Meals that required no conversation. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed someone he barely recognized. His eyes looked tired and empty. His shoulders seemed permanently hunched forward, as if he was protecting himself from invisible blows. When he tried to smile, it looked fake even to himself. The pain inside him had become like background music, always there, coloring everything else. Some days it was louder, some days quieter, but it never completely went away. He had gotten used to carrying it around like an old injury that aches when the weather changes. He started avoiding places where he might run into people he knew. The coffee shop near his office where he used to grab lunch became off limits after he spotted a former colleague there. The gym where he had a membership sat unused because too many people might ask how he was doing. His phone contained dozens of unread messages from friends and family members. "How are you doing?" they would ask. "Let's get together soon." He would read these messages and feel a strange mix of gratitude and irritation. They meant well, but they didn't understand. Talking about his problems wouldn't make them go away. It would just make everyone uncomfortable. The weekends stretched endlessly. Saturday and Sunday felt like vast empty spaces that needed to be filled somehow. He would clean his apartment, watch movies, run errands he didn't really need to run. anything to make the time pass. Sunday nights were especially brutal because they reminded him that another week was starting, another week of going through the motions. Sometimes he wondered if this was just how life was supposed to be for someone like him. Maybe some people were meant to be alone. Maybe he had used up his chance at happiness, and this was what remained. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. If this was just his reality, then at least he could stop hoping for something different. But late at night, in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, he sometimes felt a small voice inside him that disagreed. It whispered that things could be different, that this wasn't the end of his story. He usually pushed that voice away. Hope felt dangerous when you had been disappointed so many times. The man who had once felt confident and capable now doubted every decision he made. Simple choices like what to have for dinner or which route to take to work became overwhelming. He second-guessed himself constantly, wondering if he was making the wrong choice again. His apartment became his fortress and his prison, safe from the judgment and pity of others, but also cut off from any possibility of connection or joy. He had built walls so high and so thick that he couldn't see over them anymore. The pain he was trying to protect himself from had become the only thing he could feel. As another evening settled around him like a familiar blanket, David sat on his couch and stared at the wall. Tomorrow would be another day of pretending to be okay, another day of going through the motions. He had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that a simple moment of human kindness would crack open something inside him that had been locked away for too long. As the weeks turned into months, David found himself sinking deeper into a routine that felt more like survival than living. Every morning, his alarm would ring at 7, and he would lie in bed for an extra 10 minutes, gathering the energy to face another day. The simple act of getting up had become a monumental task. His coffee maker became his most reliable companion. While it brewed his morning cup, he would stand by the kitchen window, watching people walk to work or jog through the neighborhood. They all seemed to move with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going and why. David envied that certainty. His own days felt like he was walking through thick fog, unable to see more than a few steps ahead. The phone calls from friends became easier to ignore. When his college buddy would call on Thursday nights like he always used to, David would watch the phone ring until it went to voicemail. Later, he would listen to the message, "Hey man, just checking in. Call me back when you get a chance." But David never did call back. What would he say? That he spent most evenings sitting in his chair, staring at nothing? That he had forgotten what it felt like to laugh? His sister tried harder than most. She would text him pictures of her kids, funny memes, or just simple messages asking how his day went. David would read them and feel a stab of guilt. She was trying to stay connected, but he felt like he was looking at her life through a window. Her world seemed bright and warm, while his felt cold and gray. Work became a performance. He had perfected the art of appearing normal during the 8 hours he spent at the office. He would arrive on time, attend meetings, complete his assignments, and make small talk by the coffee machine. But it all felt mechanical, like he was playing a character in a movie about someone else's life. His boss noticed his lack of enthusiasm during team meetings. "You seem quiet lately," she mentioned one afternoon. David forced a smile and said he was just focused on his projects. The truth was, he had stopped caring about quarterly reports and client presentations. Everything felt meaningless, like moving papers around on a desk while the building burned down around him. Lunch breaks became solitary affairs. Instead of joining colleagues at nearby restaurants, he would drive to a park and eat a sandwich in his car. He would watch other people walking their dogs or playing with their children, feeling like an observer of a life he used to understand but could no longer access. The grocery store trips revealed how small his world had become. He would walk the same aisles, buying the same basic items: bread, lunch meat, frozen dinners, coffee. His cart looked like it belonged to someone who had given up on the idea that food could be enjoyable. The teenage cashier would sometimes try to make conversation, but David had lost the ability to engage in even the simplest social exchanges. His apartment reflected his internal state. Dishes would sit in the sink for days because washing them required more energy than he could muster. Mail piled up on the kitchen counter, mostly bills and advertisements that he would eventually sort through with the enthusiasm of someone doing homework for a class they hated. The television became background noise, something to fill the silence. That felt too heavy. He would flip through channels without really watching anything, settling on whatever happened to be on. Sometimes he would fall asleep on the couch and wake up hours later to infomercials selling products that promised to make life easier. Sleep patterns became chaotic. Some nights he would stay awake until 3 in the morning, scrolling through social media and seeing updates from people whose lives seemed perfect in comparison. Other nights he would go to bed at 8:30, not because he was tired, but because being unconscious was better than being awake. His dreams, when he could remember them, were often about being lost. He would find himself in familiar places that had somehow changed, unable to find his way home. Sometimes he would dream about his ex-wife and daughter, conversations that felt more real than his actual interactions with them. He would wake up feeling worse than when he went to sleep. The mirror in his bathroom became something he avoided. When he did catch glimpses of himself, he saw someone he didn't recognize. His face looked thinner, his eyes duller. He had started wearing the same few shirts to work because choosing clothes felt like an overwhelming decision. His car became a sanctuary of sorts. During his commute, he could listen to music or talk radio and pretend he was just like everyone else heading to work or home. But even in traffic jams surrounded by hundreds of other cars, he felt completely alone. Exercise, something he used to enjoy, became impossible. His gym membership card sat unused in his wallet. The idea of changing clothes, driving to the gym, and being around other people felt exhausting before he even started. His body began to feel sluggish and weak, matching how he felt inside. Weekend invitations from family members went unanswered. His cousin's birthday party, his nephew's baseball game, his aunt's anniversary dinner. He would read the invitations and feel a combination of guilt and relief. Guilt for disappointing people who cared about him. Relief for not having to pretend to be okay for hours at a time. The holidays approaching filled him with dread. The thought of Christmas dinner conversations, of people asking how he was doing, of having to smile and act grateful, felt impossible. He started planning excuses months in advance, work trips that didn't exist, illnesses that weren't real. His relationship with his daughter became even more strained. During their scheduled phone calls, she would tell him about school projects and friend drama, but he struggled to engage. His responses became shorter, his questions fewer. He could hear her growing frustrated with his lack of enthusiasm, but he didn't know how to fix it. Money became another source of stress. With only one income and the expenses of maintaining 2 households after the divorce, his savings were shrinking. He would lie awake calculating how long he could maintain his current lifestyle, adding financial worry to his growing list of concerns. The man who once had opinions about everything now found it difficult to care about anything. Politics, sports, movies, current events all seemed to happen in a world he was no longer part of. Friends would try to engage him in conversations about topics he used to be passionate about, but he felt like he was speaking a language he had forgotten how to speak fluently. Each day felt like a repeat of the one before, an endless loop of going through motions without purpose or joy. David had become a ghost of himself, present in body but absent in spirit, watching his own life from a distance he couldn't bridge. The call came on a Tuesday night while David was heating up another frozen dinner. The microwave was humming its familiar tune when his phone buzzed on the counter. He almost didn't answer it. These days, phone calls usually meant work problems or telemarketers. But something made him glance at the screen, and when he saw his ex-wife's name, his stomach dropped. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than expected. "David, I need you to stay calm, okay?" Her voice was tight, controlled in that way it got, when she was trying not to panic. "There's been an accident." The frozen dinner forgotten, David felt his legs go weak. "What happened? Is she okay?" She's okay," his ex-wife repeated quickly. "But she was in a car accident about an hour ago. A minor one, but she hit her head on the steering wheel. They want to keep her overnight for observation. David was already grabbing his keys before she finished talking. Which hospital? St. Mary's downtown. David, she's been asking for you. Those last 5 words hit him like a physical blow. His daughter had been asking for him. After months of awkward phone calls and one-word text responses, after feeling like he had become irrelevant in her life, she wanted her dad. The drive to the hospital felt both endless and too short. David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He kept replaying every conversation he'd had with his daughter over the past few months, searching for signs he might have missed. Had she been trying to reach out while he was drowning in his own problems? Traffic lights seemed to last forever. At each red light, David would tap his fingers on the steering wheel, fighting the urge to run through the intersection. His mind created worst-case scenarios that he knew were irrational, but fear doesn't listen to logic. When he finally reached the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and the bright fluorescent lights made everything feel surreal. The receptionist directed him to the 3rd floor, and he took the stairs 2 at a time because waiting for the elevator felt impossible. He found his ex-wife in the waiting room, still wearing her work clothes, her hair messy like she had been running her hands through it. When she saw him, relief flickered across her face. "She's in room 314, she said, standing up. "The doctor said she has a mild concussion, but her CT scan looked good." "She was wearing her seatbelt, thank God." David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They walked down the hallway together in silence, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. It felt strange being next to her again. United in worry for their daughter, the hospital room was dimly lit, with machines beeping softly. In the background, his daughter lay in the bed, looking smaller and younger than her 16 years. There was a bandage on her forehead and her eyes were closed. For a moment, David thought she was sleeping, but then she opened her eyes and saw him. "Dad?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "Hey, sweetheart." David moved to the chair beside her bed, his throat tight. "How are you feeling?" "My head hurts," she said, and then, to his complete surprise, she started crying. Not the angry tears of a teenager having an argument, but the scared, vulnerable tears of a child who needed comfort. Without thinking, David reached for her hand. She squeezed his fingers tightly, and he felt something crack open inside his chest. When was the last time she had needed him like this? What was the last time he had been present enough to notice if she did? "I was so scared, Dad," she whispered. "I kept thinking about all the things I never said to you, about how I've been acting lately." David felt tears burning behind his own eyes. "You don't need to worry about any of that right now. You're okay. That's all that matters." "But I do need to worry about it," she said, her grip on his hand tightening. "I've been so angry at you and Mom for the divorce, and I took it out on you because you seemed like you could handle it better. But then tonight, when everything went dark for a few seconds after I hit my head, all I wanted was my dad." The words hit David like a tidal wave. His daughter had been angry, yes, but she had also been protecting him in her own teenage way. She thought he could handle her anger better than her mother could. She didn't know that her distance had been slowly killing him inside. "I'm here now," he managed to say. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a while, her hand in his, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. David felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. His daughter needed him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt capable of being what someone else needed. His ex-wife returned with coffee and sat on the other side of the bed. The 3 of them stayed like that through the night, taking turns dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chairs. When morning came and the doctor cleared their daughter to go home, David felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Relief that she was okay, but loss because this moment of being needed was ending. As they prepared to leave the hospital, his daughter hugged him tighter than she had in years. "Thanks for staying, Dad. It meant everything." Driving home alone, David felt the familiar weight starting to settle back on his shoulders. The crisis was over and life would return to normal. But something fundamental had shifted during those hours in the hospital room. For the first time in months, his pain had taken a back seat to someone else's need. He had remembered what it felt like to be essential to another person's well-being. He had felt the strength that comes from being needed, the clarity that comes from having a purpose beyond your own suffering. It was a reminder of who he used to be, who he could still be, but as he sat in his empty apartment that evening, the silence felt heavier than ever. The brief glimpse of connection made his isolation feel sharper by contrast. He had tasted what it was like to matter again, and now he was back to feeling invisible. The experience had cracked something open inside him, but he didn't know what to do with that crack. It felt dangerous and hopeful at the same time. For months, he had been protecting himself from further pain by staying disconnected. But in that hospital room, he had remembered that connection could also be a source of strength. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages he had been ignoring. Maybe it was time to stop protecting himself from the world. Maybe it was time to remember that other people might need him too, just like his daughter had needed him that night. 3 days after the hospital night, David found himself standing in line at his usual coffee shop, staring at his phone like everyone else. The morning rush was in full swing, and the line moved with the typical efficiency of people who had places to be and schedules to keep. David had fallen back into his routine, but something felt different. The crack that had opened in the hospital room hadn't closed completely. He was scrolling through work emails when he heard a commotion ahead of him. Looking up, he saw an elderly man at the counter, fumbling with a small leather wallet. The man's hands were shaking as he tried to count out coins, and David could see the frustration building in the line behind him. The cashier, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, was tapping her fingers impatiently on the register. "Sir, the total is $4.57, she repeated, her voice carrying that edge people get when they're trying to be polite. "But are running out of patience." The elderly man looked up with confused eyes. "I'm sorry, dear. I thought I had exact change." His voice was soft, almost apologetic, and David could hear the embarrassment in it. The man's gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore a pressed button-down shirt that suggested he had taken care with his appearance this morning. But his hands continued to shake as he sorted through quarters and dimes. Behind David, someone sighed loudly. "Come on, old man," a voice muttered. "Some of us have jobs to get to." David felt his jaw tighten. He watched as the elderly man's face flushed red with embarrassment. The man began putting coins back into his wallet, clearly preparing to leave without his coffee. "I'm sorry," he said to the cashier. "I don't think I have enough today." Something inside David snapped into action. Without really thinking about it, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said to the cashier, pulling out his own wallet. "I'll cover the difference." The young woman behind the register looked surprised, but she accepted David's $5 bill. "Would you like change?" "Keep it," David said, then turned to the elderly man. "Your coffee's on me today." The man's eyes widened, and for a moment, David thought he might cry. "Oh my," he said, his voice shaky. "You don't need to do that, son." "I want to," David said, and he meant it. "We all have tough mornings sometimes." The elderly man extended a trembling hand. "I'm Robert, and you've just restored my faith in humanity." "David," he replied, shaking the man's hand gently, "just paying it forward." As Robert collected his coffee, he turned back to David. "You have no idea how much this means to me. I've been having a very difficult time lately, and your kindness reminds me that there are still good people in this world." David watched as Robert carefully made his way to a corner table, moving slowly but with dignity. The rest of the line had resumed its normal pace, people already forgetting the small drama that had just played out. But David felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. When David got his own coffee, he glanced over at Robert, who was sitting alone by the window, staring out at the street while sipping his drink. The old man caught his eye and raised his cup in a small salute of gratitude. David smiled back, a real smile that felt foreign on his face. Walking to his car, David replayed the interaction in his mind. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 minutes, cost him less than $5, and required no great effort on his part. but the look in Robert's eyes suggested it had meant the world to him. David wondered how many times he had walked past opportunities like this without even noticing them. At work that morning, David found himself thinking about Robert instead of his usual spiral of negative thoughts. He wondered what kind of difficult time the old man was going through. Was he alone? Did he have family nearby? Was money tight, or was there something else troubling him? During his lunch break, David found himself driving back to the coffee shop, hoping to see Robert again. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he felt drawn to check on the man who had seemed so grateful for such a small gesture. Robert wasn't there, but David ordered another coffee and sat at the same table where the elderly man had been that morning, looking around the coffee shop. David began to notice things he had missed before. The barista, who seemed tired and stressed, probably working multiple jobs to make ends meet. The woman in the corner who kept checking her phone with worried expressions, maybe waiting for news about a job interview or a medical test. The businessman at the counter, who looked as lonely and disconnected as David had been feeling for months. Everyone had something going on beneath the surface. Everyone was carrying burdens that others couldn't see. For months, David had been so focused on his own pain that he had forgotten this basic truth about human existence. We're all struggling with something. The realization hit him like a gentle wave. His pain wasn't unique or special. It was part of the human experience. And just as Robert had been touched by a simple act of kindness, maybe David's own healing could come through recognizing and helping with the struggles of others. That evening, instead of his usual routine of microwave dinner and mindless television, David found himself thinking about his interaction with Robert. The old man's gratitude had been so genuine, so heartfelt. When was the last time David had made someone feel that way? When was the last time he had looked outside his own problems long enough to see someone else's need? He thought about his daughter in the hospital, how natural it had felt to be there for her, how right it had felt to be needed. Maybe that was part of what he had been missing. In his isolation, he had cut himself off not just from receiving help, but from giving it. David began to think about other times in his life when helping others had made him feel good about himself. Coaching his daughter's soccer team when she was younger, helping his neighbor move furniture, volunteering at the food bank during the holidays. These memories felt like they belonged to a different person, someone who had been confident and engaged with the world. As he sat in his quiet apartment, David realized that the encounter with Robert had done something unexpected. It had reminded him that he was capable of making a difference in someone's day. His actions could matter to other people. He wasn't just a burden or a disappointment. He could be helpful. He could be kind. He could make someone's difficult day a little bit easier. For the first time in months, David went to bed feeling something other than emptiness. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was something. A tiny spark of connection. A small reminder that he was part of a larger human community where people could help each other. Even in the smallest ways. He didn't know it yet, but that simple act of kindness had planted a seed that would grow into something much larger. The 3 minutes he spent helping Robert would ripple outward in ways he couldn't imagine, changing not just one elderly man's morning, but the entire direction of David's life. 2 weeks had passed since the coffee shop incident, and David had almost forgotten about Robert. Almost, but not quite. Something about that morning kept floating back to his mind at unexpected moments. During boring meetings at work, while waiting at traffic lights, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him. The image of the old man's grateful eyes refused to fade completely. David was at his desk, mindlessly sorting through emails when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was spam or a wrong number, but something made him pause and open the message. "Hello, David. This is Robert from the coffee shop 2 weeks ago. My granddaughter helped me get your number from the manager there. I hope you don't mind me reaching out." David stared at the screen, confused. How had Robert gotten his number? And why would he reach out after all this time? He scrolled down to read the rest of the message. "I wanted you to know that your kindness that morning meant more than you could possibly imagine. I was having what I can only describe as one of the darkest periods of my life. Your simple act of generosity reminded me that good people still exist in this world. You were a light in my darkness, and I needed you to know that." David read the message 3 times, each reading hitting him differently. The first time, he felt surprise. The second time, confusion. The third time, something much deeper began to stir. Robert continued, "I don't know what was going through your mind that day, or what kind of day you were having, but you chose to help a struggling stranger. That choice changed something in me. I hope this message finds you well, and I hope you know what a difference you made." David set his phone down and stared at his computer screen without seeing it. Robert had been having one of the darkest periods of his life. Those words echoed in David's mind. The elderly man with the shaking hands and apologetic voice had been struggling with something much deeper than counting change for coffee. Suddenly, the morning at the coffee shop looked completely different in David's memory. He had seen an old man embarrassed about not having enough money, but Robert had been carrying pain that David couldn't see. David's small act of kindness had reached someone who was drowning in his own darkness. Just like David had been drowning in his dot, the realization hit him like a gentle but persistent wave. Robert hadn't just been grateful for the coffee money. He had been grateful for the reminder that kindness existed, that people still cared about strangers, that he wasn't completely alone in his struggle. David picked up his phone and read the message again. "You were a light in my darkness." When was the last time anyone had described David as a light? For months, he had felt like nothing but shadow and weight, a burden on everyone around him. But to Robert, in that moment, he had been something positive and helpful. He thought about all the times over the past few months when he had felt invisible, irrelevant, like his presence or absence didn't matter to anyone. But here was proof that his actions could have real impact, that even small gestures could reach people in profound ways. David started typing a response, then deleted it. "What do you say to someone who tells you that you were their light in the darkness?" He tried. "Again, Robert, thank you for reaching out. I'm glad I could help that day." But it felt inadequate. He deleted it and tried once more. "Robert, your message means more to me than you know. I'm grateful our paths crossed that morning, and I hope things are looking brighter for you now." He hit send before he could second-guess himself again. Within minutes, Robert replied, "They are brighter, thanks in part to you." Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest impact. I'll never forget what you did. David leaned back in his office chair, his mind racing. If Robert had been struggling with darkness and David's small gesture had helped, what did that mean? It meant Robert wasn't the only one fighting battles that others couldn't see. It meant David's assumption that he was uniquely broken, alone in his pain, was wrong for months. David had been trapped in the belief that his suffering was different, heavier, more overwhelming than what other people experienced. He had isolated himself because he thought no one could understand what he was going through. But Robert's message suggested something different. It suggested that pain was more common than David had realized, and that people helping each other through that pain was not only possible, but necessary. David thought about all the people he encountered every day. The cashier at the grocery store who always looked tired. The security guard at his office building who worked long hours for little pay. His coworkers who smiled and made small talk but might be carrying their own heavy burdens. How many of them were having dark periods like Robert had been having? The thought was both overwhelming and oddly comforting. Overwhelming because it meant there was so much suffering in the world that he had been blind to. Comforting because it meant he wasn't alone in his struggle. David began to see his interaction with Robert in a completely new light. It hadn't been about him being particularly generous or special. It had been about recognizing a moment when another human being needed help and responding to that need. The fact that it had cost him less than $5 and taken only a few minutes didn't make it less meaningful. It made it more meaningful, because it proved that making a difference didn't require grand gestures or perfect circumstances. He thought about his daughter in the hospital, how natural it had felt to be there for her, how right it had felt to be needed. That same feeling had happened with Robert, but he had been too wrapped up in his own problems to recognize it at the time. David realized that for months, He had been asking the wrong question. Instead of, why do I hurt so much? Maybe he should have been asking, how can I help others who hurt? Instead of, why doesn't anyone understand my pain? Maybe he should have been asking, whose pain am I not seeing? The idea felt revolutionary and terrifying at the same time. Revolutionary because it offered a way out of the endless cycle of self-focus that had been trapping him. Terrifying because it meant admitting that his approach to handling his problems had been making them worse, not better. Robert's message had done something unexpected. It had shown David that even in his darkest period, he was still capable of being someone's light. It had proven that his actions mattered, that his presence in the world could be positive and helpful. For months, he had been convinced that he was nothing but a burden, a source of disappointment and concern for the people around him. But Robert's gratitude told a different story. It told the story of a man who, despite his own pain, had noticed another person's struggle and responded with kindness. It told the story of someone who still had something valuable to offer the world, even when he couldn't see his own worth. As David sat in his office, holding his phone with Robert's message glowing on the screen, he felt something shift inside him. It was subtle, like the first hint of warmth after a long winter, but it was real. For the first time in months, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't involve staying trapped in his own darkness forever. That evening, David sat in his apartment staring at Robert's message for what felt like the 100th time. The words, "You were a light in my darkness," kept running through his mind like a song he couldn't shake. For the first time in months, he felt something other than the familiar weight of his own problems pressing down on him. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Mike. They had been friends since college, roommates for 2 years, best man at each other's weddings. Mike had called several times over the past few months, but David had let every call go to voicemail. The messages had started enthusiastic, then concerned, then eventually stopped coming altogether. David stared at Mike's number for a long time. What would he even say? "Hey, sorry I've been ignoring you for half a year while I felt sorry for myself." It sounded pathetic even in his own head. But Robert's message had stirred something in him. A curiosity about what other people were going through. A desire to connect that he hadn't felt in a very long time, before he could talk himself out of it. David pressed the call button. Mike answered on the third ring. "David, holy crap, man. I was starting to think you'd moved to another planet." "Hey, Mike." David's voice felt rusty from disuse in conversations that weren't about work or basic necessities. "I know it's been a while. How are you doing?" There was a pause, and David could almost hear Mike recalibrating his expectations for the conversation. Single quotes, well, honestly, I've been better, but never mind that. How are you? I've been worried. About you? Actually, David said, surprising himself, I called because I wanted to ask how you're really doing. I know I've been a terrible friend lately, but I realized I haven't actually checked in with anyone in months. Another pause. Are you feeling okay? You sound different? David laughed, and it felt strange in his throat. I sound different because I am different. Or at least I'm trying to be. But seriously, Mike, how are things? Don't give me the polite answer. Give me the real one. Mike was quiet for so long that David wondered if the call had dropped. Then he heard his friend take a deep breath. Since you're asking for real, things have been pretty rough, actually. Lisa and I have been going to couples therapy for the past 4 months. We're trying to figure out if we can make this work or if we should call it quits after 15 years. The words hit David like a punch to the stomach. Mike and Lisa had always seemed like the perfect couple, the ones who still held hands at parties and laughed at each other's jokes. If anyone had asked David 6 months ago which of his friends had a rock-solid marriage, Mike and Lisa would have been at the top of the list. Mike, I had no idea. What's been going on? It's complicated, Mike said, and David could hear the exhaustion in his voice. We just apart, I guess. Started living like roommates instead of partners. The counselor says it's common, but it doesn't feel common when you're in the middle of it. Some days I think we can fix it. Other days I wonder if we're just prolonging the inevitable. David felt something crack open in his chest. While he had been drowning in his own divorce aftermath, his best friend had been fighting to save his marriage, and David had been completely absent. Why didn't you tell me? I mean, I know I've been hard to reach, but ... David, man, you've been going through your own hell with the divorce and everything. The last thing you needed was me dumping my problems on you too. But that's what friends are for, David said, and as the words came out of his mouth, he realized how long it had been since he'd thought about what friendship actually meant. We're supposed to help each other through the hard times. Yeah, well, you weren't exactly in a place to help anyone, from what I could tell. And I didn't want to bother you with my stuff when you were already struggling. The conversation went on for another hour. Mike talked about marriage counseling sessions that felt like negotiations between lawyers. David shared some of what he'd been going through, not the pretty version he usually gave people, but the real version with all the messy details. They talked about work stress, about feeling like failures, about the way loneliness could eat at you even when you were surrounded by people, when they finally hung up. David sat in his quiet apartment feeling completely different than he had. An hour earlier, Mike was struggling too. Mike, who had always seemed so put together, so confident, was fighting his own battles with uncertainty and fear. David thought about all the assumptions he had made about his friends' lives over the past few months. He had convinced himself that everyone else was fine, that he was the only one falling apart, that reaching out would just burden people who had their lives figured out. But Mike's honesty had shattered those assumptions completely. How many other friends had he written off as too busy or too happy to understand what he was going through? How many people had been waiting for someone to ask them how they were really doing? The next day at work, David found himself looking at his coworkers differently. Jennifer from accounting, who always seemed so cheerful and organized, was she really as happy as she appeared? Tom from IT, who made jokes to deflect from serious conversations, was he hiding something deeper? During his lunch break, David walked to the coffee shop where he had met Robert. The elderly man wasn't there, but David ordered his usual and sat at a table by the window, watching people come and go. A woman in a business suit checked her phone nervously while waiting for her order. A young man with paint-stained fingers sat alone in the corner, staring into his coffee cup like it might hold answers to questions he couldn't voice. Everyone had a story. Everyone was carrying something. The realization that had started with Robert's message was growing stronger, changing the way David saw the world around him. That evening, David called his sister. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright. With surprise? "David, this is unexpected. How are you?" "I'm calling to ask how you are," David said. "Really how you are, not the polite version." His sister laughed, but there was something brittle in the sound. "That's a dangerous question. You might get more than you bargained for." "Try me." What followed was a conversation David hadn't expected. His sister talked about the pressure of being a single mom, about feeling guilty for not being able to give her kids everything they wanted, about lying awake at night worrying about money and the future. She talked about putting on a brave face for everyone while feeling like she was barely keeping her head above water. David listened, really listened in a way he hadn't done in months. He didn't try to fix anything or offer solutions. He just let her talk, asked questions, and acknowledged how hard things sounded. "Thank you," she said when they were about to hang up. "I needed someone to hear all of that. I've been carrying it around for so long." "Thank you for trusting me with it," David replied. And he meant it. As he got ready for bed that night, David reflected on the day. 2 phone calls had completely changed his understanding of the people closest to him. Mike and his sister had been struggling with their own challenges while David had been lost in his own pain. And none of them had been talking to each other about any of it. Robert's message had started something. It had reminded David that kindness mattered, that people were fighting battles he couldn't see, and that connection was possible even in the darkest times. But these conversations with Mike and his sister had taken it further. They had shown him that healing didn't have to be a solo journey, that sharing struggles could actually make them lighter, not heavier. For the first time in months, David fell asleep feeling like he was part of something larger than his own problems. Over the following months, David began to notice opportunities for connection everywhere. It started small, almost by accident. The security guard at his office building, an older man named Frank, who worked the night shift, always nodded when David left late from work. One evening, instead of his usual quick nod back, David stopped. "Working late again?" Frank asked, looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Yeah, trying to catch up on some projects," David replied. Then, remembering his conversations with Mike and his sister, he added, "How about you? How's the night shift treating you?" Frank's face lit up with surprise. In 3 years of working in the building, probably no one had ever asked him that question. "It's quiet, which I like. But it gets lonely sometimes, you know? Especially on weekends when the building's completely empty." They talked for 15 minutes about Frank's grandchildren, his hobby of building model airplanes, and his plan to retire in 2 years. When David finally headed to his car, he felt that familiar warm feeling he'd experienced with Robert at the coffee shop. Such a simple conversation, but Frank had seemed genuinely grateful for the company. The next week, David brought Frank a cup of coffee from the shop downstairs. The week after that, he started staying an extra few minutes to hear about Frank's latest model airplane project. These small interactions became highlights of David's day, moments of genuine human connection that reminded him he was part of a larger community. At the grocery store, David began paying attention to the people around him instead of rushing through his shopping in a fog of self-absorption. He noticed the cashier who always looked exhausted, the elderly woman who struggled to reach items on high shelves, the young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained while managing a full cart. One Saturday afternoon, David saw the elderly woman from previous visits standing in the cereal aisle, clearly frustrated as she tried to reach a box on the top shelf. Without hesitation, he walked over. "Can I help you with that?" he asked. "Oh, would you? These old bones aren't what they used to be," she said with a grateful smile. "I'm Helen, by the way. I see you here sometimes." "David, nice to officially meet you, Helen." They chatted while they shopped, Helen telling him about her weekly routine of grocery shopping on Saturdays, how she missed her late husband who used to reach all the high things for her. David found himself genuinely interested in her stories. About the neighborhood 40 years ago, how different everything looked now. When they reached the checkout line, Helen was ahead of him. David watched as she carefully counted out exact change, her movements slow and deliberate. The teenage cashier waited patiently, and David felt a surge of appreciation for the young man's kindness. When Helen walked away with her single bag of groceries, David caught up with her in the parking lot. "Helen, I was wondering if you might like some help bringing your groceries up to your apartment sometime. I live pretty close by." Her eyes filled with tears. "That would be wonderful. Dear, I usually have to make 2 trips, and the stairs are getting harder every week." From that day forward, David started doing Helen's grocery shopping with her every other Saturday. She would make him lunch afterward, serving him sandwiches on china plates while telling him stories about her life. She had been a teacher for 40 years, had raised 3 children, and now lived alone since her husband's death 2 years earlier. "You remind me of my youngest son," she told him one afternoon. "He lives in California now. Calls every Sunday, but it's not the same as having someone nearby who cares." David realized he had been giving Helen something she desperately needed: regular human contact and practical help. But she was giving him something equally valuable: purpose, stories, and the feeling of being genuinely appreciated. At work, David noticed a new employee named Carlos who always ate lunch alone. The young man seemed smart but shy, sitting by himself in the break room while others gathered in groups. David remembered his own first weeks at the company years ago, how isolating it could feel to be the outsider. "Mind if I sit here?" David asked one Tuesday, approaching Carlos's table with his own lunch. Carlos looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, of course." They started eating together regularly. Carlos was fresh out of college, living in his first apartment, trying to figure out adult life while managing student loans and a demanding new job. David found himself offering advice about everything from budgeting to office politics, remembering how overwhelming those early career years had been. I was thinking about quitting last week, Carlos admitted one day. Everything feels so hard, and I don't know if I'm cut out for this. David recognized the uncertainty in the young man's voice, the same self-doubt that had plagued his own early career. The first year is always the hardest, he said. You're learning not just the job, but how to be an adult in the working world. It gets easier. Over the weeks, David watched Carlos gain confidence. The young man started speaking up in meetings, asking questions, making connections with other coworkers. One day, Carlos thanked David for the mentorship. You probably don't realize how much our lunch conversations have helped me, Carlos said. Having someone believe in me made all the difference. David's relationship with his daughter began to improve as well. Instead of their awkward phone calls where he asked surface questions and she gave surface answers, he started sharing more about his own struggles and growth. He told her about Helen, about Carlos, about the ways he was learning to connect with people again. Dad, you sound different, she said during one of their calls. Happier. More like yourself. I'm learning that helping other people helps me too, David explained. It's weird how that works. His daughter started opening up more about her own challenges. School stress, friend, drama, uncertainty about college and the future. David listened, without trying to fix everything, offering support instead of solutions. Their conversations became something both of them looked forward to instead of obligatory check-ins. The changes rippled outward in ways David hadn't expected. Mike, inspired by David's transformation, started reaching out to other friends who had been isolated during difficult periods. David's sister began volunteering at her children's school, finding community with other parents who were juggling similar challenges. Helen introduced David to her neighbor, another elderly man who had been struggling with loneliness since his wife moved to a nursing home. Soon, David was helping both of them with groceries and small household tasks. The elderly man, George, was a retired mechanic who taught David basic car maintenance in exchange for help organizing his garage. Carlos started his own mentoring relationship with an intern who joined the company. David showed me how much difference it makes when someone takes an interest, Carlos explained to David. I want to pass that forward. At the coffee shop, David became a regular who knew all the baristas by name. He learned that Jessica was saving money for nursing school, that Tyler was supporting his younger siblings while their mother recovered from surgery. Small conversations and occasional tips became investments in their dreams and struggles. The apartment that had once felt like a prison now felt like a home base for a life filled with meaningful connections. David's calendar, once empty except for work obligations, now included coffee dates with Robert, who had become a dear friend, lunch plans with Carlos, grocery trips with Helen, and regular phone calls with friends and family who had become central to his healing. Every act of kindness seemed to create ripples that spread far beyond what David could see. The security guard Frank started reaching out to other lonely coworkers. Helen began hosting small dinners for neighbors who lived alone. Carlos's increased confidence led to better performance at work and a promotion that changed his entire trajectory. David had learned that healing wasn't a solo journey. It was something that happened in community, through the simple act of caring about others and allowing others to care about you. The pain he had carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed from a weight that pulled him down into a bridge that connected him to the struggles and joys of others. A year had passed since Robert's life-changing text message, and David barely recognized the man he used to be. Standing in his apartment on a Saturday morning, he looked around at a space that had been completely transformed. The bare walls that once reflected his emptiness now displayed photos of the people who had become central to his life. Helen and her late husband at their wedding 50 years ago, Carlos at his recent promotion celebration, Frank with his latest model airplane, his daughter at her high school graduation. Beaming with pride, the kitchen counter that used to collect unopened bills and takeout containers now held thank you cards and letters from people whose lives had intersected with his. A note from Jessica, the barista, announcing her acceptance into nursing school. A photo from George showing off the classic car they had restored together over 6 months. A Christmas card from Mike and Lisa celebrating their renewed marriage. After working through their difficulties, David's morning routine had changed completely. Instead of lying in bed dreading the day ahead, he woke up thinking about the people he would see and help. Saturdays meant grocery shopping with Helen, followed by lunch where she would share stories about her teaching days and ask about his week. Sundays often included coffee with Robert, who had become like a grandfather figure, full of wisdom about life's ups and downs. The pain that had once consumed David wasn't gone entirely. There were still difficult days, moments when loneliness crept in or regret over lost time weighed heavily on his shoulders, but the nature of that pain had changed fundamentally. Instead of being a solitary burden that isolated him from the world, it had become a bridge that connected him to others who were struggling. When he felt sad about his failed marriage, he could use that experience to comfort Carlos, who was navigating his first serious relationship. When he worried about his relationship with his daughter, he drew on that concern to help George, who was struggling to reconnect with his own adult children. The pain that had once felt pointless and destructive now served a purpose. It made him more sensitive to the pain of others. David's work life had improved dramatically as well. His supervisor had noticed his increased engagement and leadership skills. The mentoring relationship with Carlos had expanded into a formal program where David helped train new employees. His colleagues sought him out for advice not just about work but about life challenges. He had become someone people trusted with their struggles, and that trust was a responsibility he took seriously. "You're different," his daughter had told him during one of their recent phone calls. "I mean that in the best way. You used to seem so lost, like you were going through the motions. Now you sound like you have a reason to get up in the morning." She was right. David did have reasons to get up in the morning, multiple reasons. Helen needed someone to drive her to doctor appointments. Frank looked forward to their evening conversations about everything from current events to memories of better times. Carlos had started bringing his girlfriend around, and they both looked to David for relationship advice. Robert called every Tuesday evening just to check in and share stories about his own week. The apartment that had once echoed with silence now buzzed with activity. Friends dropped by regularly. Helen brought homemade cookies and stayed for tea. Carlos and his girlfriend came for dinner and game nights. Even David's ex-wife had commented on the change when she came to pick up their daughter after a weekend visit. "You seem more at peace," she had said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice for the first time since their divorce. "I'm glad you found your way back to yourself." David had started volunteering at the local community center, teaching basic life skills to young adults aging out of foster care. Every Thursday evening, he worked with kids who reminded him of Carlos when he first started at the company, smart but scared, capable but lacking confidence. These young people had faced challenges David could barely imagine, but they responded to his patient guidance and genuine interest in their success. "Mr. David," one of the teenagers had said after a particularly difficult session about job interviews, "you're the first adult who's made me feel like I might actually make it in the real world." The comment had brought tears to David's eyes. A year ago, he had felt like he was failing at everything. Now he was helping young people believe in their own potential. The transformation felt miraculous, but David understood it wasn't magic. It was the result of choosing connection over isolation, service over self-pity, hope over despair. His relationship with his daughter had become one of the brightest parts of his life. She visited regularly now, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely enjoyed spending time with him. She had met Helen, Carlos, Frank, and Robert, and she often commented on how much she loved seeing her father surrounded by people who cared about him. "I was so worried about you after the divorce," she had admitted during a recent visit. "You seemed like you were disappearing, like you were becoming a ghost of yourself. But now you're more yourself than you've ever been." David had learned that healing wasn't about returning to who he used to be. It was about becoming someone new, someone shaped by struggle but not defined by it. The man he had been before his marriage fell apart had been successful but isolated, capable but emotionally disconnected. The man he had become was more vulnerable but also more resilient. More aware of his own limitations, but also more confident in his ability to make a positive difference. Robert often talked about the ripple effects of kindness, how one small act could spread outward in ways the original actor never imagined. David could see those ripples everywhere in his life now. Helen had started hosting weekly dinners for elderly neighbors who lived alone. Carlos had begun mentoring newer employees, passing forward the guidance David had given him. Frank had joined a support group for people dealing with late-life loneliness, becoming a source of encouragement for others. The young adults David worked with at the community center were finding jobs, going to college, starting families of their own. Jessica had graduated nursing school and started working at the Children's Hospital, already making a difference in young patients' lives. The connections David had made were creating connections for others, building a web of support that extended far beyond what any single person could achieve alone. On quiet evenings, David sometimes pulled out his phone and reread Robert's original message, "You were a light in my darkness." Those words had changed everything, not because they revealed some hidden truth about David's character, but because they reminded him of a truth he had forgotten. Every person has the capacity to be light for others, even in their darkest moments. The simple signal Robert had sent hadn't just shifted something inside David. It had awakened something that had always been there but had been buried under layers of pain, fear, and self-doubt. The capacity for kindness, for connection, for making a difference in other people's lives. These weren't special gifts reserved for certain people. They were basic human abilities that everyone possessed, but that pain and isolation could make us forget. As David prepared for bed on this Saturday night, surrounded by evidence of a life rebuilt on the foundation of service to others, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete gratitude for his journey, including the darkest parts. Without the pain that had brought him to his knees, he never would have learned the lessons that had lifted him up. Without the loneliness that had nearly destroyed him, he never would have discovered the healing power of genuine human connection. The man who had once struggled alone against his own pain had become someone who helped others transform their struggles into sources of strength and compassion. The signal that had shifted everything inside him had become a signal he now sent to others every day through his actions, his presence, and his unwavering belief that no one has to suffer alone.